This is Freya Waley-Cohen, the contemporary composer, whose debut album, Spellbook, is being released on October the 25th, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think, yeah. So Freya's music takes inspiration from folklore, literature, all sorts of places, um, in which, as in Witch, her first opera, she took inspiration from the Salem witch trials, interweaving a kind of magical, realist coming of age story with the historical horror of what it was to be a human fighting for freedom. So, Spellbook, your new album, I mean, you start to think about, the link of witchcraft, of magic. Is it what it says on the tin? Is it about spells and magic?
Yes, the album contains a few different things, but the sort of centerpiece is a spell book in the form of a song cycle. It's based on a poetry collection by Rebecca Tamash, which is called Witch, similar to my opera. So that was also inspired by that poetry collection. Um, but in this case, I'm setting directly the spell poems in her collection. So they're contemporary spells, playing with what the form of a spell is, the idea of sort of putting words together in a certain order, ritualizing them and performing them out loud, and the idea that that could change the world in some way, sort of reach out into the world and make a difference, or whether good or bad, spells aren't always positive, are they? But reach out into the world. And I suppose that's what music does is, you go to a concert and you hear something, and very, very occasionally you go to a concert that's really special and makes you see the world slightly differently afterwards. And that is a kind of spell. So I think these two things sort of have this, um,
Something in
yeah,
common. They have this
have
common
have
sort of
this in common.
overlap.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. So the song cycle is called Spellbook, and it is a set of spells, and there's eight of them. And the other things on the album are sort of magical objects in a way, inspired also by ideas of things that are slightly in between what we know and what we believe. So one of them is called Conjure. It's a trio, and it's performed by my sister Tamsin and Bilby and Nathaniel Boyd. So a string trio. And it's thinking about the rule of three and the idea of three people sitting together and what they would conjure up. And sort of that as a starting point for the form of the string trio. And then Talisman, which is for the Manchester Collective and performed by them. And that's for 13 strings, 13. So it's sort of string ensemble, but actually they each have their own individual parts. And it's sort of about the idea of how events or the idea of a ritual creates magic in an object. So when we say that an object is a talisman or it's something that's sort of special and set apart, often some sort of event has happened around that object that has made it special to us. So that's sort of the crux of that piece. And then there's Naiad, which is a mixed ensemble piece also performed by the Manchester Collective. It's an octet. And that, of course, a naiad is sort of a type of water spirit. Um, but that was actually commissioned in memory of my teacher, Oliver Nasson. And it's sort of inspired by um, almost the idea that when someone you love has passed, you see um, fragments of them in the sort of tiny details of the world around you. Things like the sort of dappling of sunlight through the leaves, or um, dew on the leaves in the morning, or sort of iridescence on a cobweb, and that sort of a sound, sort of commemorating, or it's in memory of Ollie, that piece.
I guess in the way the spell conjures up something, those things conjure up the idea of somebody, the essence of
Yeah,
somebody.
yeah.
Yeah. And I want I get the feeling that magic is something that fascinates you. And I
Yeah.
wonder what it is that fascinates. Is it in the way that it fascinates, us as children, or is there something more to it?
I think it's both. I think, when you compose, it's a form of play and a form of uh yeah, sort of there's something childlike about it. Um in its sort of purest form. So yeah, there is something like a sort of childlike fascination with this idea of um magic, but actually um it's more than that. It's this sort of place in our consciousness that poetry, music, and sort of ideas about the occult or magic sort of all sit in, which is this sort of in between world. There's in this White Review essay, Rebecca Smash refers to that as sort of the membrane between like realities, and I think that's something really it's something that's inspired my music. And I suppose when you're composing, um it's sort of looking for things that spark that.
I guess music is a sort of in between reality, isn't it?
Yeah. Of course, in some ways it's a deeply practical thing. You put the notes on the page and someone plays them and all of that, and you actually have to be quite practical to be a composer, because you've got to make sure it works for the instrument and everything playable and all of those things. But our experience of what music does for people and why it's sort of special and held in the regard that it is, there is something sort of intangible and um it's, of course, it's not supernatural, but it's somewhere in between supernatural and logical, I suppose.
Yes,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose magic is also, in a way, a metaphor for all sorts of things. I guess in the way you were talking about, there's a kind of experience of bereavement, when you
Mm.
imagine things that are not quite there. Certain things bring up the idea of a person, conjure up the essence of a person. That's a sort of magic in a way, isn't it? And it's
Yeah. I suppose also going back to the spell book itself as opposed to the instrumental pieces, um, it is a sort of almost like filter or lens through which to look at ideas around feminine power and where women have been allowed to have power or have taken power for themselves, and also ideas about different points of view that aren't sort of often um, seen as savory within the sort of normal framework of society, if that makes sense. So yeah, I suppose the opening spell is um, sort of a summoning spell for Lilith, who is in sort of very ancient stories, the first wife of Adam, created at the same time, who chose to leave the Garden of Eden rather than submit to Adam, and then was offered by God in these sort of myths to come back to the Garden of Eden or become a demon, and chose to become a demon. So then if we're, it's sort of yeah, this looking at things from outside a little bit, to be being a witch, to be casting a spell. Not that I think of myself as a witch, but to embody that and that sort of um like raw and less polite sort of power in these songs.
and I guess magic is you could be a synonym just for power.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
There is a sort
Yeah.
of there is a power that magic gives you, and I guess that is what you're exploring.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly.
And is there in terms of uh what you like to hear in music when you're listening to music, do
Yeah.
you tend to go for for scores which conjure up some sense of the supernatural?
I suppose that's maybe subjective. I mean, as I think you know, my favorite composer is Messiaen, and I actually think that that's quite a good description of a lot of his music.
Mm.
It's, I mean, of course, he was a devout Catholic, so the supernatural is different for him perhaps than to me. But the type of Catholic he was sort of absolutely almost psychedelic, visionary type stuff, and uh, even in his works, which are about things like love, to him, love is sort of almost part of the supernatural because it is such an intense experience. And I think one of the things I love in his music is that sense of sort of pure ecstasy, which feels like it sort of does go beyond the everyday. I mean, another one of my favorite composers who's completely different is Schubert. And I don't know, there's something in his melody writing, because he is, you know, one of the, if not the great melodist. Um, Maybe there's something supernatural in why those melodies make us feel the way they do versus any other pattern of notes make you feel some other way. But also there's something deeply grounded and earthly in his writing. So yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
hard
and
to
I guess
say.
I mean, it's hard to draw the line, isn't it? I guess you could say that
Mm.
all music is that is what it is by the very nature of it. You know, it's something that you can't touch. It's something
Yeah,
that takes you somewhere else in your imagination.
yeah,
But I guess there are some composers who really embrace that idea.
yeah,
Messiaen definitely would be one of them. Apart from anything, his music is so colorful, isn't it?
yeah.
It's fantastical and colorful with bizarre instruments, you know, that don't sound like anything that you would imagine on Earth. Uh,
Yeah,
I suppose
absolutely.
that is very messy. And how does this kind of then this magical quality, how does it manifest in your music? Have you used unusual instruments, or is there some other way that it kind of shows itself?
So, actually, in the pieces in this album, I haven't used particularly unusual instruments. Although I recently wrote a percussion quartet which uses sort of Pyrex mixing bowls and sets of vintage teacups. So that's fairly unusual. But um, in the pieces in this album, it's actually, you know, standard acoustic instruments.
Mm. In terms of
In the
the musical effects, or kind of
Yeah, um, in each piece, I suppose it's a little bit different. In Conjure, I suppose there are passages where there's sort of a closeness of harmony and a delicacy with which it's, you know, directed to be performed and also sort of shaped, which to me feels like it's this um sort of almost shimmering sort of vision that's coming up, or spirit. Um, I think in a very different way in Talisman and in some of the spells, it's to do with sort of writing little rituals into the music that feel like they ritualize little objects that sort of come back and then transform. Um, and that's most obvious in the spells. So I suppose each of the spells in the poetry and their, to me, my interpretation of the poetry, and therefore in the way that I've written it, there's a way in which they act as spells as opposed to, you know, standard poems, whatever a standard poem is. Some of them, there's a moment of transformation where it's here is the moment where the spell is happening, the sort of core of it. And so at that moment, the music sort of twists upside down. I don't mean literally using the notes upside down. I mean sort of something sort of transforms within the music and the way in which the singer is expressing at that point. In some of them, it's more of a almost cumulative, you know, conjuring, there's that word again, the idea of layering images on top of each other until they add up to something more than they are. Um, so I sort of played with what makes each one magical in a slightly different one. The one that I was thinking of that sort of layers things like that is Spell for Joy, which almost has this sort of frenzied recklessness to it. And at the end, the singer, the words in the poem are say yes 5,000 times, oh love. And the singer, she doesn't actually say yes 5,000 times, but it feels like 5,000 times how many times I've written yes in this pattern over the strings, sort of circling round ecstatically underneath it. And it ends with her running out of breath and gasping. So it's sort of this like huge exhalation of energy and joy in the concept of joy is something reckless that we need to experience through sort of letting go. Um, in other spells that are sort of slightly more the sort of slower music, slightly more reflective, it's often something a little more subtle, that moment of transformation. Sort of we sort of sit back into different harmonies within the music and everything sort of slightly um expands in that moment. So yeah, I've sort of tried to play with where the moments of magic are in each of those spells.
Okay, gosh. Well, Freya, I can't wait to hear the album. It's been
Thanks.
fascinating to talk to you about it, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more of the same, then feel free to hit subscribe on our channel, or for more similar coverage, visit our website at www.thecuspmagazine.com. Thanks, and I'll see you another time.